Okay, so hello everyone, welcome to the podcast. I'm absolutely excited to host this with Adam today and to welcome you all for this informative PSW doubt clearing session, you can say, or I would just simply say a podcast. What what we have done for the podcast is we have tried to divide it into eight different topics, and there are overall 20 or 22 questions. So Adam will be answering all the questions that I've received on Instagram. But before getting into the questions, let's get to know our speaker better. So today's guest is Adam. Adam is an immigration lawyer and he's a founder of Access UK Visa. I think it will be better if I leave this to Adam to introduce himself well. So over to you, Adam.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sandy. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here. So, my name's Adam. I am an OISC accredited immigration lawyer based in the UK. I'm a solo firm. I do a lot on social media in terms of posting relevant, helpful content for internationals in the UK. My primary focus in terms of what I do for clients is working with students, graduates, young professionals, and entrepreneurs. So that looks like things like sponsor licensing for companies and also various visa queries for individuals.
That's very interesting to know, Adam. Actually, I came to know about you through your LinkedIn post only. So, guys, I would highly recommend that you follow Adam on LinkedIn. He already has around 35,000 students following him. And what I'll do is I'll drop his LinkedIn link in the description below so that it will make it easy for you to find him and you can connect with him and clear out your doubts. So, let's start today's session and let's see what do we have in store for today. Okay. So today our questions are divided into eight sections, Adam. Some of them are very basic, which starts with introduction to PSW. What is it? Does someone need to have a job in order to file a PSW? What are the restrictions on the visa? When should one apply for it? What is the new entrant rule? Because a lot of students are confused about the new entrant category. And what are alternate pathways and how can someone stay in the UK apart from PSW? What are other options? So we'll go to the question number one, which is what is a PSW visa and who is it intended for?
So, the PSW is primarily for those who come to study in the UK who've successfully completed their course. So once you've successfully completed your course, you'll be invited to apply for the graduate visa. It's essentially a 2-year visa, generally speaking, where you have a lot of work freedoms within the UK. So of course that gives you time to test out the job market or test out starting a business and to see whether the UK is a good fit for you in the long run.
Makes sense. So this is basically a visa only for those who are coming to the UK to study.
Correct.
And if anyone has done their undergrad from UK and they've already availed PSW, can they then do masters and then again apply for PSW?
So generally speaking, the graduate route, which is the latest manifestation of PSW, if you will, is only usable once per lifetime. There is an interesting technicality where before the graduate route was abolished a number of years ago, the phrase PSW was originally coined a few years ago. I think it was Theresa May brought it in, and then it was ended temporarily for a couple of years, and then the graduate route was introduced.
Mhm.
There is a slight technicality where if you were within the PSW cohort, and I'm talking sort of 5, 7, 10 years ago,
Okay.
you technically speaking, if you did study again, you could avail yourself of the graduate route. But of course, that wouldn't necessarily apply to everybody. It's quite a niche thing.
That is super interesting to know. That is super interesting to know. And if any one of you who is looking at this podcast have studied in the UK more than 5 or 6 years ago, then maybe they can explore this technicality. But it will entirely depend on what the situation visa regulations were back then, and then what are the regulations right now. Thank you for letting me know about that, Adam. I had no clue about it. We'll move on to our second question, which is does one need to create a UKVI account for PSW application if they already have one from student visa?
So everybody's being invited to create a UKVI account. And what tends to be happening is when people select the relevant link to make their visa application, it's tending to divert people to sign into their e-visa, their UKVI account.
Okay.
So what I'd recommend doing, just for to simplify the process, is create your UKVI account, and then of course from there you can log into your details when you enter the relevant application link to be able to do that. So that's what I recommend.
Okay, so regardless if you have a UKVI account or not, you can create a new one and then start your PSW application. Is that the?
That's what I tend to recommend. I mean, the interesting thing is that with the graduate visa, when they were rolling out the immigration ID check app, which is what they're rolling out across a lot of visa routes now, including skilled worker,
Yeah.
they actually initially rolled that out with the graduate visa.
Okay.
So there is the ability to be able to verify your identity via the app. So then you don't have to go to a biometrics appointment, which is great.
Interesting. Interesting. Thank you for answering that, Adam. And I'll move on to our next question, which is, so this is a question which I've got from two, three people, and everyone had their different timeline. So if someone's visa is expiring on 25th of January, what is the best time to apply for a PSW and why? Like how much before can they apply? That's the question.
So the soonest you can generally apply is when your relevant educational institution has informed the Home Office that you've successfully completed your course. So normally your university or training provider would notify you that they have informed the Home Office and then you are eligible to apply for the graduate route.
Hmm.
So you can apply as early as that.
Okay.
However, it is worth hanging on a little bit if you can, because obviously the sooner that you apply for the visa, the sooner you get the graduate visa, and that could essentially cut into the remainder of your student visa,
Exactly.
and by implication, actually diminish the total amount of time that you're able to get into the UK. So, what I tend to recommend, unless you have urgent or imminent travel plans, for example, is hold off on submitting that application towards the latter end of your student visa,
Hmm.
because then you're going to be getting the most out of your student visa that you've paid for.
Makes sense.
And then, of course, you'll get the maximum amount of time for your graduate visa without it eating into your existing student visa time, if that makes sense.
Perfect. So if someone's visa is expiring on 25th January and if 24th January is also a working day, can they apply on 24th January or should they apply at least a week before?
So you can technically apply right up until a day before the expiry. Obviously, it's
Okay.
a little bit risky. For
Yep.
example, if there was like an IT issue or a technical issue that prevented you from being able to physically submit it on time. However,
Hmm.
that is perfectly possible if you're willing to do that.
Hmm.
There's a section of the rules called 3C leave. And 3C leave basically means that if you submit a valid visa application before your current visa runs out, your current visa will then essentially be extended up until the point you get a decision on your new visa.
Very interesting.
So, so if you really wanted to stretch it out, you could apply towards the expiry of your visa as long as you submit it in time. So it has to be submitted before the visa expires itself. And then you must stay in the UK, of course, whilst it's processing, because if you leave the UK whilst your visa's in process, then it will automatically cancel it, and nobody wants that.
Agree. And I think someone also asked me this question that I've applied to PSW, can I travel outside? So that explains that answer that no, you should not travel outside uh, if your student visa has expired.
And
And
until you get the decision on your
yeah.
graduate visa, yeah.
However, if you have student visa, then maybe you can travel and come back before it expires.
Technically speaking, yes. One thing I would add to that is if the only exception to that would be is if you'd finished your course early.
Hmm.
So one common pitfall that students can sadly find themselves in is if they finish their course early and then perhaps they travel outside of the UK because they think they can leave and come back before the end of their student visa. But what happens is if a student finishes their course early, the university notifies the Home Office, and then the Home Office issues a curtailment notice. So that's sort of cutting short their visa. The
Interesting.
main problem with traveling outside the UK when this happens is if you get that notice whilst you're outside the UK, then your permission to be in the UK will automatically be cancelled. So
Oh,
again, very serious. You don't want that to happen, and obviously that will jeopardize people's chances of getting the graduate visa as well. So just a word of caution to anybody who's in that particular position right now.
that is super interesting. I didn't know that. So that's a big risk if your university has informed the home office that your course has completed and you happen to be traveling outside, then your visa will be curtailed and you will not be allowed to come back. Not just that, you cannot even apply to graduate visa because you will not be in the UK. You need to be in the UK for that.
Yeah, so that would particularly apply if you'd finished your course earlier than what is on the CAS course end date.
Okay.
So then, if you'd finished your course on time, there's no need to worry.
Okay.
If you've finished it according to the time that's scheduled in your CAS.
Hmm.
Um, if, however, you have finished it earlier than expected or stipulated on the CAS, and then you went travelling, that's when you're at risk of your visa potentially being cancelled.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you for that, Adam. I think we should move on to the next question. And the next question is, does the 2-year graduate visa start from the date of application or date of visa approval?
So generally, it should be from the date of visa approval. Yeah,
Okay, makes sense. Yeah. Next
and
question
it's
is,
two. It's a fixed period, so it's 2 calendar years.
okay.
Mhm.
So next question is, my BRP shows a visa expiry date of 31st December, but my e-visa states 30th January. Which date should I consider? I think 30th January.
You're absolutely right. So the reason why it says 31st of December on BRPs, it actually says 31st of December for pretty much everybody's BRPs because they're all being cancelled and we're all switching to e-visa. So the the date that you see on your e-visa status is the one that you want to be looking at.
Perfect. So, guys, when Adam said BRPs are getting cancelled, they are getting replaced. So, go with the date which is on your e visa. Don't worry about the physical expiry date mentioned on your BRP because everyone's BRP will expire after 31st of December this year. Thank you, Adam. I'll move on to the next question, which is it mandatory for a student to have a job while applying for a PSW? I think no.
No, it's not mandatory. The main requirements really for the graduate visa is that the person has successfully completed their course, that the institution has notified the Home Office that this has occurred. And of course, they meet all the other eligibility requirements. They pay the visa fee, the IHS fee,
Mhm.
and of course, they don't find themselves in any reasons for refusal. For example, whether it's criminality or things like that. As long as they're not breaching any of those areas, then the key point is really passing the course, completing the course, and paying the relevant fee and submitting a valid application.
Okay. One thing which I should clarify to everyone here is that I am referring to graduate visa as PSW interchangeably,
Oh,
which is
yes, right, yeah.
it's, technically not the right term. So pardon me for that. If you see PSW written on the slide, consider it as graduate visa. And whenever I
Yes.
say PSW, consider it as graduate visa because now it is called graduate visa. So apologies for that, everyone. We'll move
They're
on to the
kind
next.
of they're kind of interchangeable, aren't they? And it's totally understandable. Now you've got the historical context as to why
Yeah,
people use
exactly.
PSW.
Exactly. So we'll move on to the next question, which is related to employment condition. How many hours can we work if our studies are completed and we are planning to apply for a PSW in January? Can someone even work up till 60 hours during this time if they want to?
So once you have successfully completed your course, this, for the purposes of your working conditions, this would be considered outside of term time. So from the point that it's confirmed that you've successfully completed your course
Mhm.
and the end of your particular student visa, that would be considered to be outside of term time.
Okay.
Therefore, there are no restrictions in terms of employment. You can work as many hours as you feel you can or want to during that particular time.
Perfect. However, I will not recommend anyone to work for 60 hours. You are being harsh on yourself. So just take some rest, guys.
Yeah,
Take care of yourself as well.
it's not sustainable, is it?
Yep, it's not. Okay, we'll move on to the next question, which is, Are there any restrictions related to maximum working hours on graduate visa?
Um, Generally speaking, no. So individuals can work as much as they like. There's a lot of
Hmm.
working freedoms on the graduate visa. People can be employed, they can be a sole trader, they can be the director of their own limited company if they want to.
Interesting.
Now, the only thing that would apply here is the working time regulations. Now, this is broader employment law. So, the working time regulations mean that if you want to work over 48 hours per week for a particular employer,
Hmm.
you need to essentially opt out of this working times legislation. So, you need to provide notice in writing to your employer that you're happy to be working over 48 hours a week. That's the only thing to consider, but that doesn't necessarily have any bearing on your visa, or the visa doesn't explicitly state that there's any limit on working hours.
Okay. Adam, since you mentioned that letter that you need to submit to your employer, does the previous question, so whoever asked that question, wherein they want to work for 60 hours, do they need to also follow the same approach, same method of informing their employer that they would be working more than 48 hours?
So if it's for the same employer, then yes, you would need to provide notice in writing that essentially the employee gives their consent to working over 48 hours.
Okay.
Part of the reason the rule is in place is basically to prevent people being taken advantage of, right? So to prevent employers just assuming that workers have to work 60 hours a week without the employee explicitly consenting to do that.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Thank you, Adam. So the next question is related to travel. How long can I stay outside the UK in one go while on PSW visa, and can I re-enter and exit again?
There's no um, there's no restrictions on travel or absences during PSW/graduate visa.
Hmm.
Um, Being outside for any particular period of time is not going to invalidate or cancel your visa. I know lots of people who spend chunks of time, significant periods of time outside the UK, and they come back towards the end and perhaps make other plans to switch their visa. That's absolutely fine. So there's no restrictions in that regard in terms of the short term, let's say. There's completely free movement in and out of the UK during the graduate visa. The only thing I would add to that is if you are looking at the 10-year long residence route as your plan B, which I would recommend everybody's plan B is as an international, then there are specific requirements in terms of absences. So, for example, generally speaking, you shouldn't be outside the UK for more than 180 days in any 12-month period. So, for example, if you were outside of the UK for more than 180 days during that 12-month period, you might find that you wouldn't be able to count that time, that specific time that you have perhaps on the graduate visa or the student visa towards your 10 years. It might delay that particular process. The only other thing that I'd add is that, for example, if you get a sponsored job or you move to another visa that has a financial requirement, and let's say that your sponsor maybe hasn't agreed to certify maintenance, which is basically one of the requirements of the skilled worker visa, is to ensure that the candidate has enough funds for their first month of work. If you are outside the UK for more than 3 months at a time, within the 12 months prior to switching to a visa, such as the skilled worker visa or the innovator founder visa or the global talent visa, for example, you may find that you will need to show evidence of savings in order to support your application for that visa, rather than banking on having been in the UK for at least 12 months prior to going onto that visa.
Interesting. So in the short run, there may be no implications, but if you are planning for a 10-year route, you need to check out those rules and then plan accordingly. That's what I'm getting from here.
Correct.
So next is, can I travel to my home country and return to the UK while my PSW application is still being processed? This we discussed, and I think the answer is that No, you cannot.
Correct. It's no. So you mustn't travel outside of the UK whilst your visa application in process, whether it's graduate visa, PSW, or any other type of visa. You mustn't leave the UK during that time. Otherwise, your visa application will be automatically cancelled, and then you'll be outside the UK, so you won't be able to re-enter and reapply. So it'll be a very messy situation that you must avoid that at all costs.
Adam, in this situation, some people mentioned to me that there might be an emergency at home. So, are those exceptions considered here, or there are no exceptions to this rule?
Yeah, so exceptional circumstances, compassionate circumstances, of course, are considered. For example, I've had clients in the past where perhaps their visa application is taking some time. Maybe they've had an interview, they're still waiting, and they have a family emergency or they have something that they need to attend to back home. In those particular cases, what I'd recommend doing is getting in touch with your local MP, your local member of parliament, who represents your constituency in parliament, and to inquire with them because they have a direct line to the Home Office, and so they can raise your case on your behalf and they can seek to assist you in getting some exceptional assistance to be able to leave the UK.
I'm sure that will be helpful to know for a lot of students. Thank you for that, Adam. Let's move on to our 11th question, which is I'm planning to go to India in January on my e visa, but my BRP will expire by then. How can I get through immigration?
So we've had an update recently from the Home Office that people will still be able to travel and return to the UK up until March of 2025 with an expired BRP. That's if individuals have not been able to switch to e-visa. Now, generally speaking, with the e-visa, the guidance assures us that the Home Office have briefed various carriers internationally around the world in terms of how the system works. And because passport details are linked with your e-visa, as long as the current passport that you're using for travel is the one that's registered with your e-visa, the two should automatically be linked. So you shouldn't necessarily have to get out your smartphone. You shouldn't necessarily have to see if you have Wi-Fi.
Interesting.
Um, Generally speaking, it should, in theory, be integrated. However, it's a very big rollout and there are bound to be teething problems along the way. But that would be my recommendation.
Okay. Um, Perfect. The next question is slightly lengthy. So this person has asked about salary requirements. Do I need to meet the 38,700 pound salary threshold for the company to sponsor me after my graduate visa? Or can I be considered a new entrant and continue working on a salary of 30,960 or more? So this is a very hot and trending topic, Adam. I must tell you, a lot of students are exploring the new entrant route, and there is some confusion also, like what roles qualify for it and what are the salary thresholds. So if you can shed some light on it.
So, recent graduates can absolutely qualify as a new entrant. There's a few things that people need to know. There is a limited time period that you can be a new entrant, and that limited time period is 4 years. The 4 years will also take into account time on a graduate slash PSW visa or skilled worker visa. So, for example, if you're on that graduate visa and you're coming to the end and switching at the end, then you would only be eligible for 2 years on that reduced rate salary. Of course, if you switch straight from the student visa at an eligible time, so for example, shortly before you complete your course or before your visa expires, then you would be eligible for a full 4 years. One other thing that catches people out is that when they apply via this route, the certificate of sponsorship duration and the visa duration have to match identically the closing of that 4 year window that I just mentioned. It's
Interesting.
not possible, unfortunately, to have a longer visa, for example, a 5 year visa, and simply just update the salary later on. It has to be specifically for that time window. And then once you reach the end of that qualifying period that you have, that 4 year max, then you would need a new COS and a new visa to extend your stay in the UK. And of course, that would need to be under another points option. So you'd need to be paid a higher salary. Now, in reference to the 38,000 and the 3960, the 38,700 is the general threshold for what's called option A, which I call the straightforward salary requirement. And the 30,960 is the absolute minimum that you could be paid if you qualified as a new entrant. Now, of course, it varies depending on what job code that you're going for. One more thing I'd add as well is that the hourly rate is also very important too. So it's 30,960 and £15.88. So you could meet the 30,960 but not meet the hourly rate, in which case you wouldn't be eligible. So there are some things to be mindful of.
Okay. So yeah, I think you've explained all the technicalities very well, and I wouldn't add another thing to confuse anyone to this answer. So yeah, we'll move on to the next question, which is, if someone is sponsored while on their PS graduate visa, how long can they maintain a salary of 30,960? I think this person will get more clarity if they would listen to the previous answer.
Absolutely, yeah. So what I tend to say as a frame of reference, if you're on the PSW, you take the first dates, the date that your visa was granted. So, for
Hmm.
example, it was the 1st of December 2022.
Hmm.
And then you would chart forward 4 calendar years. So, in that particular case, it would be 1st of December 2026. And then when your employer comes to assign your certificate of sponsorship, they would need to make sure the work end date is no later than the end of that 4 year window. In this particular case, 1st of December 2026.
Okay.
So so by doing that, obviously, you might switch at various points. You might switch right at the beginning, 6 months in, 18 months in, right at the end. And that way, you're just preventing yourself from accidentally calculating the wrong date, basically.
Interesting. So being cognizant of the exact date that you have to clock or time out your visa on is very important in this case.
Mm, yeah.
Coming to the next salary, I think this answer is very simple. 30,960. We just discussed this. So I'll skip this question. Is the new entrant route only available for those under the age of 26? I remember seeing this as the first condition in 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 the list of conditions wherein you can be considered as new entrant. But a lot of people reach out to me, Adam, who are 27, 28, even more, and I think this inquiry would be from someone like those people only. Like, is it only for people who are less than 26?
So there's a number of criteria where you can be classed as a new entrant. Now, the important thing is that you only need to meet one of those criteria, not multiple
Yep.
of those criteria. So one of the criteria will be under 26. Another criteria will be a recent student graduate. Another criteria, for example, would be that you're being sponsored in certain roles, in academic and science related roles. There's a number of codes that also qualify for new entrant. You just have to tick one of those. So the reality is that somebody's 60-year-old grandmother could come and study in the UK, and the irony is that they could be classed as a new entrant when they come to get a job, right? The point I'm trying to make with that is that it's one or the other, right?
Yep.
So it's having said that, if you are under 26 and a recent graduate, the time spent as a recent graduate will still count towards that 4 year period.
Okay. Okay.
So, because sometimes people come to me and they'll say, "Well, I'm a recent graduate, but I'm still under 26. Can I get the full 4 years?"
Mhm.
Um, but according to the rules, any time spent on the graduate visa or the skilled worker visa will count towards that 4 year period.
Interesting. Interesting. So if you're under 26, no, you don't get any discount. And if you're over 26, yes, you are still eligible for new entrant category. rule?
So if you're under 26, for example, and you were applying on purely on that basis and you hadn't studied in the UK, you weren't a graduate, you could get the full 4 years.
Hmm.
If you were under 26 and also a recent graduate, that time as a recent graduate would still count even though you're under 26. So the fact that you're under 26 sort of doesn't negate the fact that you've been a recent graduate as well in terms of the 4 year window.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Um, the next question is very specific to a certain occupation code. So it says for buyer and procurement positions, occupation code 3551, the standard ongoing salary is depicted as £33,000 per annum on the UK skilled worker visa website. But for normal skilled worker visas, the salary is 38,700. If I secure a position under the buyer occupation code, which salary requirement do I need to meet?
This addresses a very important issue, which is the general overview websites on the government for salaries are unhelpful and misleading. I would recommend going to something called Appendix Skilled Occupations. If you put that into Google, it'll take you to that site. So, Appendix Skilled Occupations has a number of tables that contain the job codes and the relevant salaries. So, what you need to do is go to Appendix Skilled Occupations, go to Table 1 because you're applying to skilled worker visa for the first time since after the rule change, and then you find your relevant code. Then you need to look in the first salary column on the left, which is option A,
Mhm.
for example, if they're going for the straightforward salary. And then what you need to do is remember that with every points option, there's always two options for salary, and you always have to go for the higher one. So in this particular context, let's say that happens to be the salary in option A in Appendix Skilled Occupations.
Hmm.
But the thing is, it's lower than the threshold of 38,700, in which case you would go for the threshold of 38,700.
Oh, so whichever salary is higher, you'll have to go for that. It will not be the
Correct.
lowest salary, but the higher salary.
Yes, and that would also apply, for example, if you went to that same table and you went to the far right, which would be option E, um, it's 30,960 or the 70% mark of the
Yep.
salary, whichever is higher. So, for example, you cannot necessarily just blanket say that the code that you're doing is going to be the 30,960 for new entrant. You need to double check to make sure, because if it's a higher paid code, it may well be that the salary is actually higher than 30,960.
Interesting, interesting. I think this is a very specific problem that someone is facing, and there will be a lot more like you out there who would be facing these problems. I would recommend the best way to go about this is to get in touch with Adam directly through his LinkedIn page, and I've dropped the link in the description already. Just book a call with him, clear out your doubt on the call, go to the website while you're on the call with him and check for yourself. And that's the best way to get clarity. That is something that I would do if I were in your situation.
And
Um,
absolutely, and just to add to that quickly, so you mentioned at the beginning, I've essentially released a kind of guide slash cheat sheet today actually on LinkedIn, which is a free resource that basically breaks down a lot of the process in terms of sponsorship and skilled worker visa and salaries. And so I've made sure to include as much detail as I can that's helpful to you. So if you're interested in that resource, just head over to my LinkedIn and please just find the relevant post I've just posted today. I think it's gone pretty viral. And then, of course, I'll send that to you as soon as I can.
Perfect. So I think we only have 5 or 6 questions left. We'll go through them quickly.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. So the next is, I think this question someone has asked who came to student visa with their dependent. So they are asking, can they first apply for their graduate visa and then later on get their dependent on a graduate dependent visa?
Technically speaking, yes, the main applicant can apply first. The
Mhm.
main condition would be that the dependent obviously needs to submit their visa application before their student dependent visa expires. That would be the main caveat. So, for example, they wouldn't necessarily be able to leave the country, the visa expires, and then apply to return as a graduate dependent. The student visa to the graduate visa tends to be a one-way street. So you cannot necessarily either revert back from another visa, or you also cannot, in the majority of circumstances, have dependents join you straight onto the graduate visa without having been first on the student dependent visa.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So technically, yes, but ideally, Adam, what do you recommend? Like, should they apply together for the sake of convenience and getting their application sorted at once?
I think that would be the simplest and most straightforward way. Obviously, I can appreciate, maybe cash flow might be an issue
Yep.
for some people. So they might think, okay, I want to apply for the first visa and then delay a few months if I can to apply for the rest because I know it's a lot of money. And so not everybody may have the ability, to be able to lodge the applications at the same time. But yeah, that if that's possible, then that would be my recommendation.
Perfect. Um, the other one is, if council tax has not been paid from September to December, can it affect a PSW or work visa application?
That's a very interesting question. I think the answer for that would most likely depend on whether the council had referred that particular debt, if you will, further on. They'd progressed the matter. So, for example, they'd contacted the individual to give them warning, or give them notice, basically, that they're in debt. And for example, it could be passed on to a debt collection agency, or there could be, for example, a county court judgment to to try and recoup some of the fees from the individual. Generally speaking, if they haven't had any notice like that, where there's sort of been a formal warning or a notice involving the debt, then in theory it shouldn't. But like I said, if it has been taken further, for example, if they have an outstanding debt notice or there has been a county court judgment in order to try and recoup the costs, then yes, that may have an effect on the application.
So if the county has raised a notice or has raised an outstanding bill or a demand or warrant, something on those lines against you for not paying the dues, then it could be an issue. But if there hasn't been any notice sent out to you, then it should be theoretically okay.
Based on the very simplistic, sort of question, without sort of digging further into the detail, that would be my initial thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, this is very interesting, and I heard about this question last week, and I was also intrigued, like what would happen in this case. So there is someone who has moved back to their home country. They had 2 years of PSW visa, and they've moved back to their home country, and now they're looking out for jobs again in the UK. So can they be considered as new entrant?
The short answer is yes. So you can still be classed as a new entrant if you submit an application for skilled worker visa within 2 years of your student visa expiry or your graduate visa expiry, whichever is relevant. So in this particular case, it's the graduate visa, PSW. So the main caveat would be submitting a skilled worker visa application to return to the UK within 2 years of the expiry of that graduate visa. The other thing to bear in mind is because obviously the individual has used or spent those 2 years of the graduate visa within the UK, then the maximum amount of time they would be eligible for the new entrant salary rates would be 2 years. So they'd need to apply for their skilled worker within 2 years of the graduate visa expiry, and
Mhm.
then they would be entitled to 2 calendar years, essentially.
Okay, but Adam, if they have spent 1 year as on student visa and then 2 years on PSW visa, then they can only apply for 1 year as new entrant.
So when it comes to the 4 year maximum period, the only visas that count towards that period are the graduate slash PSW, The skilled worker visa, and then I think the other one is religious worker visa. That's the only other one. Student visa does not count towards that 4-year maximum period for new entrant. So
Okay.
it's only the graduate visa that's counted.
Okay, that is interesting. So if they have been in their home country for around a year, then they will only have one more year to get a skilled worker visa as a new entrant. However, if they have the full 2 years left after their graduate visa and they've just moved back to their home country, then the visa will be for 2 years.
Yes, yes. So provided they submit their application within 2 years of the visa expiry, then they would be entitled to the 2 years.
Cool. Interesting.
The only thing I would add to that would be if it was a case where it was a student and their student visa expired and they hadn't applied for the PSW, then of course, if they submitted their visa application within the 2 years, they could be eligible for up to 4 years on new entrant salaries
Interesting.
because they hadn't spent that the 2 years of the graduate.
That is super interesting take. I think it will. So a lot of students are in doubt whether they should apply for the graduate visa or not, and they want to move back to their home country. So in this case, if they even move back to their home country, there is a 4-year opportunity for them to find a job remotely from their home country and then move to UK back as new entrant at a lower salary.
Technically speaking, yes. I mean, I guess it might be more difficult not being on the ground in the UK.
Yeah.
But apart from that, technically, yes.
Yep. 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 Okay. I only have 1 year left on my graduate visa. How can I secure a sponsored visa? I think a simple answer to this would be get a sponsored job, get a job which is willing to sponsor you. But Adam, happy to take your legal take on this.
So you've got some options in terms of securing your visa to remain in the UK. So, like you said, one of the main go-tos if you're looking to build your career is to secure sponsorship with a company. So that's the first and most straightforward one. There are some other options in terms of business. If people are looking to build business, there's a couple of options there. There's the Innovator Founder Visa,
Hmm.
which is based on having an innovative, viable, and scalable business idea and plan that you plan to implement in the UK. Bit of a caveat with that one, it is actually really hard to get the endorsement for that because the bar is very high. I'm not saying it's not impossible. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it is very difficult, right?
Yep.
So that's one. And then there's the self-style sponsorship option, which is essentially the skilled worker route, but it's done in such a way so as you are able to legitimately sponsor yourself to run your own business in the UK. So a lot of the same conditions apply as the skilled worker visa because it is essentially the skilled worker visa. So having to be paid a required minimum salary, um, obviously having to devote the majority of your time to that sponsored job that you're doing. The key considerations there are you need an authorizing officer. So the authorizing officer is the person responsible for the immigration ecosystem at your company. Now, they need to be British or have ILR, and they need to have some involvement in the company. Because, for example, if there was an interview with the Home Office, the first person they would contact is the authorizing officer. So, that might be operations, for example, it might be admin, it might be HR, it might be sales.
Yep.
But you'd have to work out, they would have to have some, portion of the business in order to be able to make it work. That's just my take. So that's one other option. And then another option could be if you happen to meet and fall in love with a British or settled person in the UK. So settled means they've got ILR or they've got settlement under the EU settlement scheme. If you happen to, fall in love, maybe you've been in a relationship with somebody like that, and there's a future in it, or maybe you decide to get married or form a civil partnership, then you could explore applying to remain in the UK based on your relationship with somebody settled here.
Interesting. And I'm glad you mentioned that self sponsorship route via opening a business. A lot of people are exploring it right now, but I don't want to get into the details of that because I think it's a wide topic in itself and there are quite a lot of technicalities, and it will make up for an entirely new podcast on its own. So
Yeah,
I'll leave it for
yeah.
some time else, and I'll quickly cover the next two questions which are left. Okay, yeah, okay. Here's the elephant in the room. If we are planning to start a business that can sponsor us, what is the minimum investment required?
So my answer to that would be there is no formal minimum investment.
Yep,
So what I always say to people is it's all about context. So if you're starting a new company from scratch and you're looking to set it up in order to be able to start a business and to sponsor yourself, then obviously you don't have a trading history. You don't have any track record in terms of an entity to show that you're going to be able to pay the bills, you're going to be able to make revenue. So, one thing I'd recommend is having a business plan and include financial modeling for at least the next 3 to 5 years. Because whether you have £500 in the bank or 500,000 in the bank, it doesn't really mean anything unless you've got a solid plan where you detail basically how you're going to scale the company, how you're going to keep the lights on, how you're going to pay the bills, how you're going to pay the salaries, how you're going to get customers. All of these really, really important questions can be detailed in a business plan. So that's why I'd recommend having a business plan, because the reality is you might just dump a few thousand into a bank account,
exactly.
but your application can still be rejected because it doesn't really say very much about whether the company can actually genuinely continue to sponsor somebody.
Adam, my fundamental understanding to this is that if the business is legit and you are working with a legit plan, in most cases it shouldn't be an issue, but um, it could be an issue if you are trying to circumvent the rules by opening a business specifically for this purpose. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So the this self-style sponsorship is 100% legit. The key thing is doing it correctly. Doing it correctly, planning well, being 100% transparent, um, and and that way you will succeed basically. But if you try, for example, if you're not disclosing certain information or certain information is vague, you may find it either much harder to get a license, or you may find that you cannot pass the interview stage. So, for example, you could get interviewed, or your authorizing officer could get interviewed. And if you haven't got a solid plan in place and you don't know where you stand and you haven't thought everything through, then that's where things start to fall apart.
Exactly. And Adam, just have one follow-up question, which has just come from your answer. Are there any specific kind of businesses like tech business, retail business, restaurant business, which are preferred or which have higher approval rates for this kind of approach?
So it depends, really. I mean, there will be certain sectors that are deemed higher risk to things like abuse of the system. So, for example, one of the classic ones is like, for example, IT contractors or something like that who uh, sponsor workers and send them to work for all sorts of other people who don't have a license. Like that's quite prevalent in the UK. Obviously, we've seen in the past few years, following Brexit, we've seen a lot of abuse, sadly, of the care in terms of the care sector. Licensing and things like that. So, um, so sectors like that can attract more scrutiny. Um, but I think what I would tend to say to people if they were looking at exploring this route as somebody who runs a business themselves, I think one of the most important things is that you've got to enjoy what you do and you've got to be good at it. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Do you know what I mean? Because otherwise, it's just going to become this very significant financial burden and stress. So you
Indeed.
you really need that drive that sort of is deeper than just the visa, in my opinion.
So if someone is thinking that maybe they can bring in 100,000 pounds from their home country and navigate through the system, no, it won't work out for you. You need to be invested um logically, mentally, physically, and with all your might into the business. It should be a legit thing. Then only you will be able to sail through it, and that is my understanding.
Yeah, I think that would be my viewpoint. Yeah.
Yep. So last question. Apart from sponsorship, what are other ways for a graduate to stay in the UK?
So the only thing I'd add, in addition to the other visa paths I mentioned just now, would be the
Mhm.
global talent visa. That might be something that's quite relevant to students and young professionals. So there's a number of different routes by which you can get endorsement for the global talent visa. So one is the tech route. So Tech Nation essentially assesses applications. So it's to do with tech. Obviously that's not really my particular speciality, but there's a list of qualifying type roles that you can look at in the Tech Nation guidance for endorsement. In addition to that, whether it's the arts, you could seek endorsement through Arts Council England, or other things such as academia. So that's whether, for example, you've gotten a PhD, or you've secured a funded research job, or you've secured a fellowship, for example. UK research and innovation is another big one. Or you've had your work peer reviewed, for example. That's just a few examples of how you can gain endorsement via the academia path.
Interesting.
It's not my particular speciality. To be honest, it's quite detailed. It's kind of a niche in and of itself, really. Even just picking one of those endorsement streams.
Yep. Perfect. I think that brings us to the end of our podcast, Adam, and I must thank you for um, giving us your time and clearing all these doubts of all these students which have basically nowhere to go, and they're clueless how to approach this transition from student visa to graduate visa. I am sure a lot of people would be interested in getting in touch with you. So what I'll do, guys, is I will drop link to Adam's LinkedIn profile in the description. Feel free to go to his LinkedIn profile. There is an option you can go and book a call with him directly if there's a specific query, or if you're hesitant to share that query publicly. The best way is to reach out to Adam directly through a call, and then you can get it sorted that ways. Thank you, Adam. Are there any closing notes that you'd like to share with the audience?
I'd just like to say thank you very much, Sandy, for having me, for inviting me to come and speak. And thank you to everybody if you're still listening at this point. And obviously, just wish you all the very best.
Thanks. Thanks, Adam.